Hi, everyone. Today, what we'll do is get into the first chapter of our book. And in doing so, we'll see a little bit of overlap with the first class in terms of a little bit of background, a little bit of an introduction into symbolic interactionism. So we see a little bit of discussion that we touched on briefly before, but we'll get a little bit more depth in terms of what we're looking at in terms of the formalization of the discipline and kind of some key principles within it as a whole. So let me now pull up the slides. And as I mentioned, as a brief recap, basically what we did last class is look at kind of the history of the sociological social psychology, which ultimately kind of turned into what we call symbolic interactionism today. So, like I said, we can credit George Simmel, a classical social theorist, with being one of the first sociological social psychologists. Although he doesn't really get that credit, he was a very kind of micro-oriented, individual-oriented social theorist. So, although he's not really connected to this formally, informally, definitely you can see an influence there. And then we talk about kind of the founders of American social psychology, ultimately symbolic interactionism, George Herbert Mead and Charles Cooley. And then we talked about Bloomer kind of formalizing Cooley and Mead's ideas into symbolic interactionism. We talked about Du Bois as well. Again, not necessarily connected to those individuals, Bloomer, Cooley and Mead. He was around that same time period. And then also talked about kind of the self as a social product. And then we talked about Goffman, probably the most famous American sociologist, but also a social psychologist as well. And then I just presented to you some of the individuals we'll read about this semester in terms of contemporary American social psychologists. So that's what we touched on. And now we'll move forward today by getting into the first part of the book. And so here, the goal of the authors is to basically provide you an introduction to the key principles of symbolic interactionism and basically kind of what they're going to focus on in one way or another, no matter what topic we're looking at, no matter what chapter we're looking at throughout the textbook. So basically, a lot of people consider symbolic interactionism to be about meaning making, how people go about making meanings and using those meanings on a day-to-day basis, and how when we make meanings and we use those meanings to guide social life, we create society from the bottom up. So rather than the top down, we're looking at things at the bottom, and the ultimate product of our interactions, of us being meaning makers and meaning users, we create social life from the bottom up. So, recognizing the focus on meaning in reality, we can say two more things. We have to learn meanings. So we don't know what something represents. We don't know the meaning of something until we learn that meaning. We learn the symbolism. So, we're not born with this knowledge. It's not innate. We have to learn it through the process of socialization. Once we're socialized, kind of exposed and re-exposed to certain meanings, then we will acquire those meanings and use those meanings to guide our actions. So we can also recognize that reality itself is subjective. Uh, the meaning that something has for one person can differ in terms of the same thing meaning something differently to somebody else. So sports, for example, there are a lot of people who are really in football and define it as something personally important. But for other people, football has no kind of personal meaning to them at all. So that's just one example how meanings can differ from one person to another person. But also, in addition to meanings not having any true existence, we can say that they're very contextual. So, as I talk about here, is that looking at kind of somebody holding up two fingers, that will be defined differently. It will carry the gesture will carry different meanings according to the situation. So in one context, if you're playing baseball and somebody holds up the number two, it's about maybe throwing a certain pitch, such as here you want to throw a curveball to the catcher. In a different situation, I talked about maybe you're at a protest or something like that, and somebody throws up the gesture. There, it's not going to be about what pitch you're going to throw, but the same gesture is going to be about peace, togetherness. And then I talk about like at a barbecue where, if somebody asks a question, how many hot dogs do you want? And they give you the two finger gesture, you're not going to interpret that as being about peace. You're not going to interpret that in terms of throwing a certain baseball pitch. Rather, you want to interpret that as the person wants, two different hot dogs. So overall, meaning is a big part of the discipline, but we have to recognize that it's very fluid in nature. It's something that can change. It's something that you have to learn first, but it's important because it connects to our actions. So how we define something really shapes what we do in a given situation. If we define something to be important, good, and then we're going to act in one way. If we define something to be bad or perhaps unimportant, then we're going to react to it, act to it in a different way. So getting back to George Herbert Mead, again, a lot of his ideas we just kind of talked about in terms of different principles of symbolic interactionism. He talked about the mind being very social in nature. So, on the one hand, we can recognize that the mind is very physiological. We have to have all the proper, neurons, going back and forth. If the, synapses aren't firing, then that can lead to different issues in terms of one's mental capacities. But in addition to having, all the neurons and synapses operating properly, we have to recognize that it's very social in nature at the same time. So Mead said, yes, you need that physiological foundation, but also you need the social foundation for the mind to operate. We need to learn those meanings, the meanings that are not innate. We need to kind of learn what to do, what not to do, to be able to navigate the social world properly, because we don't have any instincts we can rely on in terms of what to do and what not to do. So we must learn those social directions to be successful and go through our lives as social beings. So we kind of recognizing that, we can say there's a dialectical relationship. There's kind of give and take between society and the mind. Uh, Society, gives us those directions, the rules by which we play, and then the mind kind of internalizes a society and kind of plays by the rules and goes about doing social life. And so when the two come together, we can have a functional society. We can have a social order as a whole. And so Mead also talked about these two dynamics that are, part of sociology as a whole, recognizing larger social forces, which we call social structures, and acts of individual free will, what we call agency. So Mead kind of recognizes that there's this back and forth between, the larger forces controlling, having a big influence in terms of what we do and how we do it. But also we do have free will, we do have agency to kind of put our own spin on things, to put our own flavor on social life. And I like to use the analogy, it's like playing cards. You can't, you can't dictate the hand that you're dealt. So that's out of your control. But you can play your cards, you can play your hand in your own way. And that kind of captures structure and agency, structure those forces that you really can't control, the hand that you're dealt, agency, playing your hand, acting with free will, basically, do what you want to do after your hand has been dealt to you. And so when recognizing this, just as an example, when you're born in a culture, the culture dictates the language you speak. So that's out of your control. That's a social structure that kind of shapes your life. And if you're born in the United States, for example, your culture kind of mandates that you learn and speak English. But on the other hand, you can speak English in your own way. You can use your own slang, you can use your own jargon, and you can kind of talk in the way that you want to talk. So you can't the hand's dealt to you. You can't pick your own language, but you can speak that language in your own ways. So there's that kind of dynamic between structure and agency that Mead really tried to highlight in his ideas. So finally, some of his ideas that got lost in the shuffle, that kind of got lost in the translation to symbolic interactionism, is that Darwinian influence. So I touched on this briefly in the previous class, but if you actually read Mead's own writings, so not the books that are popular that were actually written by his students, but Mead's own writings, you see a Darwinian influence. And the influence basically is that Mead believed that people try to adjust to their social environment and to their social roles. Basically, we want to do what we're supposed to do in given situations. Because when we make that adjustment, and when we do what's expected of us, then we don't experience psychological tension. We don't feel kind of that tension that sometimes we get when we can't live up to expectations. So basically, those who can best adopt, or excuse me, those who best can adapt to their social environments are the ones who are going to have that psychological ease, kind of a peace of mind, and those who are ultimately going to be most successful in social life. But on the other hand, those who can't adapt to their social environments, they can't do what they're expected to do, that's going to create more of a psychological tension, a psychological burden. And with that tension, with that burden, that's going to make succeeding in social life as a whole difficult. So, you see this perhaps in the classroom, if you can't live up to expectations of, being a, decent college student, getting B's and A's, then sometimes, your low marks can create that tension. But when you kind of live up to expectations, you do well in school, then you have that peace of mind. You don't experience any psychological tension at all. So now we can turn our attention to Bloomer once again. And the photo up there says Tim when he played professional football in Chicago. So, Bloomer kind of took a lot of ideas from Mead and from Cooley as well and formalized them to symbolic interactionism. And three main principles, three main premises of symbolic interactionism are listed there. So human beings act towards things on the basis of the meanings those things have for them. So kind of like I talked about, if the meaning has one thing for you, you're going to act towards it in one way. But if the meaning has a different thing for a different person, then they're going to act towards that differently. So premise number two, the meaning of such thing is created out of social interaction. So again, it goes back to that idea that we're not born with meanings. The meanings we acquire through social interactions, interacting with other people, interacting with the social world in general, whether it be a book that we read, a TV show that we watch, or simply kind of observing what's going on in life. And then finally, the third premise, these meanings can change over time. So, just because we acquire certain meaning doesn't mean that meaning is going to mean the same thing to us throughout our life course. Throughout our life course, we can adjust meanings that we have, or perhaps do a 180 totally and change what meanings have for us. So, this is one example that some people go through with like coffee or sometimes beer or something like that, or just a type of food that the first time you're introduced to it, you're exposed to it, that first sip of coffee or the first drink of beer, you define it as something negative. Oh, that's disgusting. I don't know why anybody will drink coffee, or why anybody drink beer, or why anybody want to eat such a food. But over time, if you are re-exposed to it, and you can change the meaning that you have. So you look forward to that first cup of coffee when you wake up in the morning. You look forward to that beer on the weekend, or you look forward to a certain type of food that in the past you didn't look forward to it at all because you defined it differently compared to how you define it in a positive way today. So overall, an illustration of all these premises together, I can see in Howard Becker's research he did on marijuana users. So Howard Becker wrote a lot on sociology of deviance. And in one of his books, he devotes a chapter, a study to becoming a marijuana user. And basically, he unpacks how somebody becomes a marijuana user using these three principles of symbolic contractionism. So first, if you're going to be a user, somebody who uses something on a regular basis, you must develop a positive meaning of the experience. So, if you think it's something that's going to be bad for you, or if you define it as something that you think you won't take any pleasure in, then you're not going to ever do it. If you do it and you define it as something that you didn't like, I felt paranoid, I felt out of it, was this is something that I didn't enjoy, then you're no longer going to continue to use it. You're not going to be a user. So you must develop a positive experience with the usage before you ever become a marijuana user. And how you develop this positive meaning is through social interactions, when you're actually doing it. So we start to maybe feel paranoid at first, but then overall, you find that paranoia can disappear. You define things as being okay, a little bit still normal, but you just kind of feel differently. Let's say that if you're with a group of people that are angry, if you're a group of people that are just kind of not your bag, then you're going to find it as something negative. But if you're a group of friends who are having fun and laughing with it, then again, you're going to start to define it as something that's enjoyable. So you need to define it as enjoyable, as positive, if you're going to continue to use it, and you get that meaning through the interactions during the actual usage. And then again, these meanings will evolve over time. A lot of people who do, use marijuana are paranoid at first, but then that kind of get past that paranoia and start to enjoy the kind of intoxication, enjoy the kind of state of feeling a little bit different, and they define it as something good, enjoyable. Thus, they can start that pattern of becoming a user. So again, how Becker looks at becoming a marijuana user basically is a direct reflection of the main principles of symbolic contractionism. So there are some additional premises as well. I'll briefly kind of touch on these, start from the bottom. Symbolic contractionism as a discipline kind of takes a different approach to research. You want to focus on kind of individuals, kind of smaller level activities. And in addition, we do more qualitative work. So you don't really focus on statistics too much and numbers. You want to bring to the forefront people and their actual experiences, people and their meanings that they attach to life. The social act should be a fundamental unit of study. So basically, instead of studying these big, large databases in terms of finding out whatever you want to find out about society, you want to study, social individuals, how people interact with one another, interact with groups, so on and so on. Emotions are important to behavior. So in a lot of research, in a lot of theories, people are kind of framed as not having any emotions and emotions not really mattering. But here they say they do, and we need to understand those connections between emotions and overall action. 5, 4, and 3 kind of relate to one another. And basically, we do have awareness, we do have consciousness, and we act with intention. We have that agency. And, although we may have to act within certain confinements of society, we still have the ability to play our cards in their own way. And these three premises here kind of relate to the rejection of Freud, in terms of Freud saying that, we're unconscious people in terms of how our actions develop. Here, the symbolic contractions say, no, we are aware, we are very conscious of what we do. It's not that unconscious stuff. And it's trying to get away from behaviorism too, which at the time was very popular. And behaviorism is about just kind of reacting to the stimulus. And it doesn't capture the thinking that goes on before the reaction. So we're thinking individuals, and we base our actions, what we do, what we don't do, based upon that thought, based upon the awareness. So overall, it says people are unique in the sense that we really rely on these symbols more than other, um, beings around the world to navigate social life as a whole. So just to end today, what I look at in terms of an introduction is laying out, the principles, the kind of key ideas, but also kind of applying them to our life today, because this is what you're going to be doing in the final paper of the semester. Basically, trying to take the framework and be specific with it in terms of what's going on in the social world today. So when looking at the perspective today, we can look at the individual and individual action. So how you define online learning will influence your engagement level with the class. If you just throw your hands up and say, I can't learn online, I hate online learning, then based upon you defining online learning in such a way, that's going to impact, how you actually do. It's going to impact your performance as a whole. On the other hand, if you say, hey, I don't mind online learning at all, and I actually enjoy it, then that will help you succeed more. That help better levels of engagement. How you define the class specifically, if you find social psychology to be very interesting, then that should lead to higher levels of performance because you're going to be more engaged. But if you're more ambivalent about the topic of social psychology, then you're going to be more ambivalent in terms of how you act towards it. I just want to get by in the class rather than I want to thrive in it. And education as a whole. So how do you define your education? Is it something important to you, or something unimportant? Again, I just want my degree so I can move on, or I want to take advantage of my time in college to really learn. If you choose the former, then again, you're not going to be engaged as strongly. If you change the latter, if you really embrace education, then that'll help you succeed in this class and college as a whole. So that's how we can relate symbolic interactionism to the individual level. But also we can bring it up to a more collective level, a joint action. And with joint action, you can recognize that yes, all individuals have personal meanings when it comes to social life, what matters to them, what does not. But also we can share those meanings with other individuals. And when enough people come together with a shared beliefs, then that's when you can foster collective movements. That's when you can foster social behavior, in a very organized social manner with a capital S. So today, we see different movements about reopen EPA, people who share a meaning that their personal freedoms or liberties are kind of being minimized, taken away from them. So they come organized based upon that shared belief, and they promote a collective behavior, a protest against the certain restrictions that were imposed on people during the pandemic. And also we can recognize a movement like Black Lives Matters, people who come together with a shared belief, a shared meaning of how there are racial injustices in society today on many different levels, and sharing those beliefs, these people come together in a movement. So, again, we can really start to see, how symbolic interactionism compares to people. And sometimes it's easier compared to more macro theories, because in America, we're used to kind of seeing everything on this individual level. And so sometimes this makes more sense to us because that's how we're taught to think to begin with. So we'll leave that there for today. So in our next couple classes, what I'll be doing is dividing the second chapter into two different class lectures. Again, getting kind of more into an introduction to symbolic interactionism. And then after we go through the next couple classes, that's when we're going to be completing your paper, the first kind of exam, as I call it, on symbolic interactionism. And then we'll move forward to more specific topics within the framework. So I'll leave that there. As always, if you have any questions, concerns about anything, get in touch with me, and I'll be in touch with you.